When he casually mentioned that a new patient had cancelled and offered to take me to lunch instead, I nodded, smiled, and agreed. It was ordinary, on the surface. But what he didn't know was that I had already skipped breakfast that morning, not out of forgetfulness, but because my stomach was churning with guilt. I had just finished a session with someone I should never have seen twice, let alone 3 times. And yet, I was waiting for our 4th. The truth is, it hadn't started with attraction. It began with recognition. I saw in him something familiar, something dangerously close to the version of myself I had buried years ago. When I got home that night, I found my husband reading the notes I had left on my desk, the ones I always locked away. His brows were furrowed, not in anger, but in confusion, like he was trying to solve a riddle he didn't want the answer to. I froze. There, in black ink, were words I had written after the 2nd session. He makes me feel seen. That was it. But it was enough. My husband looked up at me. Is this about me? I opened my mouth but nothing came out. And in that moment everything tilted, my profession, my marriage, my sense of self. It all started to slip. I knew I had crossed a line. But it was only the beginning. What happened next? I never thought I'd be capable of. Before I tell you the whole story, the one no one was ever supposed to know, tell me in the comments, have you ever done something that even you couldn't forgive yourself for? The chair in my office creaked as I shifted my weight, fingers tapping anxiously against the leather armrest. I watched the clock as the second hand crawled toward noon. He was due any minute. I had spent the last half hour adjusting the lighting, moving tissues slightly closer to his side of the couch, fluffing pillows that didn't need fluffing. I hated myself for how much I cared. I told myself I was just being a professional. That a comfortable setting was important for client trust. But the truth was simpler. I wanted to impress him. Not with how I looked, though I had, admittedly, changed my blouse 3 times before settling on the deep burgundy silk, but with how in control I appeared. That illusion mattered more than anything. He arrived 2 minutes early, as always. There was something about his punctuality that disarmed me. As though he respected the boundaries I was already tempted to blur. He walked in quietly, giving a slight nod before sitting down without prompting. No words yet. Just the faintest smile, polite but guarded. I took a breath. How have you been since our last session? I asked, keeping my voice even, steady. He leaned back, eyes fixed on a corner of the room, avoiding mine. I've been thinking about what you said. About boundaries. I think I might have trouble recognizing them. The irony wasn't lost on me. My spine tensed. I reached for my notebook out of habit, only to realize I had left it in the drawer on purpose. I didn't want anything between us. That thought alone should have alarmed me. Instead, it thrilled me. He continued, voice low, almost measured. I guess I never really learned how to ask for space. Or how to take it when it's given. I nodded slowly. A lot of people struggle with that. Especially when space feels like abandonment. He finally looked at me then. Really looked. And in his eyes, I saw it, recognition. Not admiration, not need. Recognition. Like he saw through the professional facade I had carefully constructed over decades. I felt exposed. And I didn't look away. That night, at home, my husband made salmon and opened a bottle of wine. He was thoughtful in the way that suggested routine rather than spontaneity. We had been married long enough to have mastered the small gestures, but the intimacy behind them had worn thin. He poured my glass, kissed the top of my head, and asked about my day. I gave him the usual version, nothing remarkable, nothing memorable. Just work. He didn't probe. He never did. After dinner, he went to his study to answer emails. I lingered in the kitchen, running my fingers along the stem of the wineglass, wondering what I would say if he asked about the patient. Wondering if I'd admit that something had shifted in me during that session. That I felt more awake in that 1 hour than I had in months. I went upstairs early. Not to sleep, but to think. I sat at my vanity, removing my earrings one by one, staring at the woman in the mirror. She looked composed. Still attractive. Still refined. But something about her eyes had changed. There was a restlessness there. I opened my journal, the one I hadn't touched in months, and wrote a single line. Today, I wanted him to stay. The next morning brought a fog I couldn't shake. At the clinic, I moved through my appointments mechanically, every other patient a blur. None of them left an imprint. None except him. And he wasn't scheduled that day. During lunch, I sat in my car instead of the break room. I scrolled through old messages from my husband. Most were short, functional. A grocery list. A reminder about bills. A link to an article he thought I'd like. I realized I couldn't remember the last time he'd asked me how I was feeling. Truly feeling. That evening, he came home early. Said he'd rescheduled a meeting to surprise me with tickets to a play I had mentioned months ago. I smiled, genuinely touched by the effort. And yet, a sharp pang of guilt followed. Not because I had done anything. But because I knew that I wanted something he wasn't offering. As we sat in the theater, his hand resting loosely over mine, I watched the actors on stage pour themselves into every gesture, every word. I envied them. The freedom to feel, to speak, to risk. I had become so used to holding back that I didn't know where my boundaries ended and my truth began. Back home, he fell asleep quickly. I stayed up, staring at the ceiling in the dark, replaying the session over and over. His voice. His words. The way he had said, I think I might have trouble recognizing boundaries. So did I, apparently. And that was the moment I understood. This wasn't about ethics or marriage or loyalty. This was about me. About a version of myself I had buried in the roles of wife, therapist, responsible adult. That version was starting to wake up. And I wasn't sure I could put her back to sleep. The days that followed were filled with a quiet I didn't trust. Not the peaceful kind that soothes the nerves, but the kind that feels like something important is being buried alive. I moved through my routine with mechanical precision: morning coffee, patient files, muted conversations with colleagues, dinner with my husband. On the surface, everything appeared intact. But beneath that surface, I was unraveling. Every time I walked past the waiting room, I looked for him. Even when I knew he wasn't scheduled. It had become instinctual, like scanning for a familiar face in a crowded station. And when I didn't see him, I'd feel both relief and disappointment in equal measure. Relief because I wasn't sure I could keep pretending. Disappointment because I wasn't ready to stop. When our next session finally came, I dressed more carefully than I wanted to admit. A soft blouse tucked into high-waisted trousers, understated makeup, just enough to appear polished but not obvious. I tried to convince myself it was habit, professionalism, nothing more. But the truth sat like a pebble in my shoe, irritating and impossible to ignore. He arrived on time, as usual, holding a coffee in one hand and a folded piece of paper in the other. His expression was calmer today, almost reflective. He sat down without a word, and for a moment, we just looked at each other in the muted light of the room. I wrote something, he said eventually, holding out the paper. I hesitated, then took it. The handwriting was firm, deliberate. It wasn't a letter, not quite a journal entry either. It was more like a confession disguised as reflection. He wrote about emptiness. About feeling seen and unseen at the same time. about the unbearable weight of being misunderstood by those closest to him. As I read, my chest tightened. It was like looking into a mirror that had been fogged for years and suddenly wiped clean. Everything I had avoided naming in my own life was laid out in his words: loneliness, emotional hunger, a craving for connection that couldn't be explained to someone who had never needed to explain it. When I looked up, he was watching me closely, his eyes searching. I nodded once, slowly, carefully folding the paper and placing it on the table between us like a fragile object. "You said something last time," he began, "about how space can feel like abandonment." I nodded again. "I think I've been afraid of space my whole life." He wasn't just talking about himself. And I wasn't just listening as a therapist. The silence that followed was not awkward. It was full. Like both of us were trying to hold something too heavy to name. After the session, I lingered by the door longer than I should have. As he stepped out into the hallway, he turned slightly toward me. Our eyes met again, and everything in me screamed to turn away. But I didn't. We kissed. It wasn't rushed or passionate. It wasn't rehearsed. It was quiet, like everything else about him, measured, deliberate, devastating. He walked away without a word. I closed the door and leaned my forehead against it, breath caught in my throat. My hands trembled as I reached for my phone, but I didn't call anyone. I couldn't. Who would I tell? That night, dinner was a blur. My husband spoke about a meeting that had gone well. I nodded in the right places, smiled on cue, but I wasn't really there. My mind was still in the office, still at the door, still in that moment. He touched my hand across the table, warm and familiar, and I flinched. Not visibly, but enough for me to feel the distance grow wider between us. I didn't pull away. But I didn't return the gesture either. In bed, I stared at the ceiling while he drifted into sleep beside me. His breathing evened out quickly, as it always did. I counted each inhale, each exhale, and wondered how many more nights I could keep pretending. The next morning, I woke up early and sat in the kitchen with my coffee, staring at the blank page of my journal. I wanted to write about what happened. I wanted to find language that would justify it, soften it, explain it away. But there were no words. Just a feeling. Not guilt. Not exactly. It was something closer to grief. Grief for the woman I had become over the years, brick by careful brick, never noticing how the walls had kept even me out. Grief for the man sleeping upstairs, who didn't even realize he had lost me a long time ago. Grief for the truth I had kept folded inside myself for so long that when it finally unfolded, I didn't recognize it anymore. Later that day, I went for a walk through the park near the clinic. It was overcast, the trees beginning to turn gold at the edges. I watched the wind scatter dry leaves across the path and thought about how nothing announces change until it's already happening. I sat on the bench and tried to imagine what the next session would look like. What I would say. What I wouldn't. Whether he would even come back. And somewhere between the clouds and the wind and the weight in my chest, I understood something quietly devastating. This wasn't about desire. It was about being witnessed. Really seen. And once you've been seen, truly, unmistakably seen, it becomes nearly impossible to go back to invisibility. When I returned home that evening, my husband was cooking again. He greeted me with a soft smile and a kiss on the cheek. I smiled back. I even meant it, in a way. But as I stood at the sink, rinsing vegetables in the steady rush of water, I knew something irreversible had happened. The ground beneath our marriage had shifted. And I wasn't sure either of us had noticed until now. The days seemed longer now. Not in hours, but in weight. Time moved like it was resisting me, like it knew I was trying to outrun something. I filled my schedule with back-to-back sessions, but nothing grounded me. Patients spoke, I nodded, they cried, I offered words that felt rehearsed. I was no longer present in the work I had once treated like sacred ground. I was drifting through it all, waiting for the next time he would sit across from me. When he wasn't there, I missed him like an ache. When he was, I dreaded it just as much. The contradiction hollowed me out. I had spent a lifetime building my identity around control, boundaries, logic. And now, one glance from a patient could unravel that entire architecture. On Thursday, he canceled his session for the first time since we met. The receptionist relayed the message with casual indifference, but it hit me like a slap. I nodded, pretending it meant nothing, then locked myself in my office for the rest of the day. I told the staff I wasn't feeling well. That wasn't entirely a lie. Alone, I sat on the edge of the couch where he usually sat, resting my palms on the cushion. It was warm, faintly familiar, as if the memory of him lingered in the fabric. I stayed like that for a long time, eyes closed, trying to summon clarity. I should have been relieved. His absence gave me space to think, to regain composure. But instead, all I felt was panic. A gnawing sense that something had shifted, and not in my favor. That night, my husband suggested a weekend away. He had found a cozy inn by the lake, the kind of place we used to visit years ago before life swallowed us. He looked proud of himself, hopeful. I hesitated. Part of me wanted to say yes, to use the trip as a reset. A way to turn back toward him, to close whatever distance had crept between us. But the other part, the louder part, knew it wouldn't help. The issue wasn't lack of time or effort. It was that I had changed, and he hadn't noticed. Still, I agreed. We left Friday morning. The drive was quiet, not uncomfortable, but empty. He hummed to the radio, pointed out trees that were just starting to turn, and occasionally reached over to squeeze my hand. I let him. I even smiled a few times. But underneath it all, I felt like a stranger in the passenger seat of my own life. The inn was quaint, just as he'd promised. Wood-paneled walls, floral curtains, a fireplace we never lit. He unpacked meticulously, placing each of his shirts on hangers while I sat on the edge of the bed, scrolling through emails I didn't need to read. When he asked if I wanted to go for a walk, I said yes. I didn't trust myself to sit in that room with him for too long. We walked along the lake path, boots crunching against the gravel. He talked about a new project at work, a client that had finally signed, a bonus that might be coming. I nodded in the right places, murmured affirmations, but my mind wasn't there. I kept imagining what would happen if I told him. Not about the kiss. Just about the feeling. That someone else had cracked something open in me. That I wasn't sure how to close it again. But I didn't. I couldn't. That night, we had dinner in the inn's small restaurant. Candlelight, soft music, couples around us murmuring affectionately. It should have been romantic. But it felt like a performance. He reached across the table, took my hand, and said, "I've missed this. You and me." I looked into his eyes and tried to feel what I was supposed to. Warmth, nostalgia, maybe even love. But all I could think about was how effortless his words sounded. How unaware he was of how far I had drifted. Later, when we returned to the room, he wrapped his arms around me. It was familiar. Too familiar. And something inside me recoiled. Not because of him. But because of me. Because I knew I was no longer fully his, and pretending felt like a betrayal. I excused myself to the bathroom, locked the door, and leaned over the sink. The mirror reflected a woman I barely recognized, tired, uncertain, afraid. I stared at myself until the tears came, silent and uncontrollable. When I returned to the bedroom, he was already asleep, his back turned, breathing softly. I lay beside him, eyes open in the dark, feeling the chasm between us grow wider with every passing breath. The next morning, I said I needed to cut the trip short. A patient emergency. He looked disappointed, but didn't argue. He never did. He simply nodded and began packing. On the drive home, I stared out the window, watching the trees blur into gold and green streaks. My phone buzzed in my lap. I glanced at the screen. It was him. A single message: "I'm sorry I missed our session. Can we talk?" My pulse quickened. I didn't respond right away. But I knew I would. Back in the city, we unpacked in silence. My husband asked if I wanted to order dinner. I said I wasn't hungry. He looked at me for a long moment, then nodded. That night, I slept in the guest room. I said it was because of a headache. He didn't ask questions. Lying on that smaller bed, surrounded by silence, I opened my phone and reread the message. "Can we talk?" I typed out a reply: "Tomorrow. Same time." My hands trembled as I hit send. Not from fear. Not from excitement. But from the weight of knowing that nothing I was about to do could be undone. And yet, I still chose to do it. The next morning, I arrived at the clinic earlier than usual. The air was cold, sharp against my cheeks, but I welcomed it. It grounded me, reminded me that I was still here, still tethered to a body, a name, a profession. The lobby was quiet, the hum of the fluorescent lights the only sound. I let myself into my office and stood in the center of the room, just staring. Everything looked exactly as it always did. The bookshelf neatly organized by category. The soft gray armchairs placed at a respectful distance. The small glass jar of peppermint candies on the side table, untouched. It was all so neutral, so carefully curated to make people feel safe, to make me feel in control. But today, it felt like a museum exhibit. A reconstruction of something I no longer lived in. I adjusted a cushion, then another. Opened the blinds halfway. Sat down, stood up, walked a small circle. I felt like a guest in my own space. Like I was preparing for a conversation I already knew would dismantle whatever scaffolding remained. At precisely 11, he arrived. He knocked softly, waited for my nod, then stepped inside. He wasn't smiling. He looked unsure, guarded, but not cold. Just deliberate. He sat down, rested his hands on his knees, and exhaled. I mirrored the gesture, not because I meant to, but because something about him always prompted unconscious reflection. There was no clipboard between us. No notebook. No clock watching us from the corner. Just two people suspended in something neither of us knew how to name. He was the first to speak. "I wasn't sure if you'd respond." I shook my head gently. I wasn't sure either. The silence that followed was dense but not hostile. It gave us space to breathe. "I canceled last time," he said, "because I needed to figure out whether coming here was helping me, or making things worse." I nodded slowly. He looked down at his hands, flexed his fingers, then folded them into each other. And I realized that I missed it. Not the talking, not the couch, not the unpacking. You. His voice didn't tremble, but it carried weight. Words that had lived inside him too long. Something inside me recoiled, not out of rejection, but out of fear. Not because I didn't want to hear it, but because I had longed for it more than I was willing to admit. "I shouldn't be here," he continued, "but I didn't want to not be here." I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. So I closed it again. He looked up at me. "I know this isn't fair to you. I know you have a life outside this room. A marriage. A structure. And I'm not asking for anything. I just needed to be honest." The honesty hung in the air like dust in sunlight, undeniable, slow, settling over everything. I finally found my voice. "Thank you for telling me." It sounded rehearsed. Hollow. But it was all I could manage without everything collapsing. He leaned back slightly, eyes scanning the room. "It's funny how this place used to feel like a sanctuary. And now it feels like something else entirely." I nodded again. "It does." He stood up suddenly, not in anger, but in resolution. "I think I should go." I didn't move. I couldn't. He stepped toward the door, paused with his hand on the handle, and looked back. His expression was unreadable, somewhere between sadness and acceptance. Then he opened the door and left. The moment it clicked shut behind him, I exhaled so forcefully it startled me. My hands were gripping the armrests. My nails had left tiny crescents in the fabric. I sat there for several minutes, staring at the space he had just vacated. The imprint of his presence still lingered. The air felt warm where he had been, and cold everywhere else. Later that afternoon, I canceled the rest of my appointments. Told the receptionist I wasn't feeling well. Again, not a lie, but not the whole truth either. I drove aimlessly through the city. Past neighborhoods I didn't usually visit. Past parks and coffee shops and intersections that had no relevance to me. I just needed motion, as if movement could undo what still pulsed inside me. Eventually, I parked outside a small bookstore. I didn't go in. I just sat there, watching people come and go. Watching strangers navigate their own lives while mine quietly bent in a direction I hadn't planned. My phone buzzed beside me. A message from my husband, "Dinner around 7?" I stared at the screen. The simplicity of it made something in my chest tighten. He had no idea where I had been. No idea what I had nearly said to someone else. No idea how deeply the foundation of our life had already fractured. I typed back, "Yes." Back home, I moved through the evening like a shadow of myself. I set the table. I stirred the pasta. I smiled when he told a story about a colleague. I kissed his cheek when he poured me wine. But none of it reached me. Later that night, as he watched TV and laughed at something I couldn't hear, I stood in the hallway, just outside his line of sight. I watched him, studied him. The man I had built a life with. The man who had never wronged me, but had also never really seen me. And I felt it again. That slow, creeping sense of inevitability. I wasn't waiting for a moment to explode. I wasn't expecting drama or confrontation. I was waiting for the quiet decision. The one that would come not in fire, but in silence. And I think, in that moment, I knew it was already made. The next few days passed like mist, thick, quiet, difficult to grasp. I moved through them with an unsettling stillness, as if each moment was being preserved, stretched beyond its natural length. My patients came and went. I nodded, I spoke, I listened. But I wasn't really there. Part of me had detached, floating above the scene like an observer. Inside the house, things were much the same. My husband maintained his routines. He read the news at the breakfast table, worked late at his desk, made us dinner with practiced ease. But something was changing. He had begun to look at me differently. Not with suspicion or anger, he wasn't that kind of man. But with a searching gaze, like he sensed something shifting beneath the surface and couldn't name it. And I had become increasingly good at not giving him anything to work with. I smiled when appropriate. I touched his hand when he reached across the table. I responded when he asked how my day was. But the words I spoke were placeholders. The real answers lived in a separate, locked room inside me. Then one evening, just before closing time at the clinic, he came back. He knocked gently, not as a patient, not even as someone who belonged in that space anymore, but as a person who couldn't stay away. I hadn't scheduled anyone for the final hour of the day. A precaution, though I wouldn't have admitted it at the time. When I saw him through the frosted glass, my pulse kicked. Not from fear. Not from guilt. Just from sheer, involuntary awareness. I opened the door and stepped aside to let him in. No words. No explanation. Just his presence filling the room. We sat down across from each other, the air tight between us. He looked exhausted, but not physically. His eyes carried something deeper, uncertainty, maybe even resignation. He broke the silence first. I've tried to convince myself that what happened didn't matter. That it was just a moment, just a misstep. I waited. But it did matter, he said. To me, anyway. I didn't know what to say. Any response felt like stepping into a current too strong to resist. He leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. You don't have to explain anything. I know the position I've put you in. I know I shouldn't be here. His voice was quiet but steady. It didn't waver. And in that steadiness, I heard everything I hadn't let myself feel: validation, conflict, and an ache that mirrored my own. I didn't come here to make things harder for you, he added. I just needed to see you once more. To know if I was imagining everything. I didn't answer. I couldn't. We sat in silence, long and dense, not awkward but suspended in something more complicated than language. Then, without prompting, he stood. His hand brushed the top of the armchair as if to steady himself, and for a moment, I thought he was going to leave without another word. Instead, he walked over to the door, paused with his hand on the knob, and looked back at me. His voice barely rose above a whisper. We kissed. And then he left. The click of the door behind him felt louder than it should have. I remained seated, staring at the space he had occupied, heart pounding with a rhythm I hadn't felt in years. My hands gripped the edge of the chair, holding me to the moment. For a long time, I didn't move. Eventually, I stood and walked to the window. The city outside was beginning to slow, streetlights flickered on, traffic softened, the sky dimmed into a muted violet. I rested my forehead against the glass, letting its coolness bleed into my skin. Something inside me had turned. Not abruptly. Not violently. But definitively. On the drive home, I didn't play the radio. I kept the windows closed, the cabin silent. My fingers drummed against the steering wheel at every red light. At home, the kitchen smelled of garlic and rosemary. My husband was making pasta again, humming faintly to himself as he stirred the pot. When he turned and saw me, his smile faltered for just a second, so quick I might have missed it if I weren't already looking for signs. Long day, he asked. I nodded, hanging up my coat. A bit. Dinner was pleasant. We talked about neutral things, the neighbor's renovation, a new movie being released, a recipe he wanted to try next week. I watched him across the table, tried to study him like a stranger. He was kind. Reliable. Present in all the ways a partner should be. But something essential between us had faded so gradually that neither of us had noticed until it was nearly gone. After the dishes were washed and the lights dimmed, we sat in the living room. He rested his hand on my knee. It was a simple gesture, affectionate and gentle. But I felt nothing. Not rejection. Not warmth. Just silence. That night, in bed, he fell asleep quickly, as he always did. I lay awake, listening to his breathing, staring at the ceiling as if it held answers. I thought about the kiss. Not its mechanics, not the physicality of it, but the intention. The way it had held 1,000 unspoken truths. A line crossed, yes. but also a line drawn. And the part that frightened me the most wasn't that I had crossed a boundary. It was how natural it had felt. How right. I didn't cry. I didn't feel shame. I just lay there, tracing invisible patterns across the sheets, wondering how much longer I could live in the gap between what I felt and what I was pretending. And somewhere in that quiet, I began to realize this wasn't a detour. This was the road. The one I had been trying not to see. The one I was already on. The days that followed blurred together like brushstrokes on wet canvas. Nothing had changed outwardly. My home looked the same, my office smelled the same, my husband still kissed me goodbye in the mornings, but everything inside me felt rearranged. Not dramatically. Quietly. Deliberately. Like furniture slowly moved in a house while no one was watching. I began waking up earlier than usual, long before the sun touched the windows. I would sit at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, wrapped in my robe, staring at nothing in particular. The silence during those hours was unlike any other time of day. It wasn't peaceful, it was exposing. There was no one to perform for. No routine to hide behind. Just me, and the growing tension between who I was and who I was becoming. I started journaling again, not in the tidy, reflective style I used when preparing thoughts for a therapy workshop or conference. These entries were unfiltered, raw. I didn't even date the pages. I simply wrote what I couldn't say aloud. Some mornings I tore the pages out as soon as I finished and burned them over the sink. Not because I feared being found out, but because the truth on the page felt too dangerous to preserve. At the clinic, I was more careful. I asked the receptionist to stagger appointments to avoid overlap. I kept the door to my office slightly ajar during sessions, a subtle gesture of self-discipline. I answered calls promptly, maintained my usual professionalism. But behind all that, there was a new current running through me. One I didn't entirely trust. He didn't come back right away. Not that week. Not the next. I didn't reach out, though the urge surfaced each time I checked my messages or glanced at my calendar. I told myself the space was necessary. That we both needed time to reassess. But beneath that logic was something simpler, fear. Fear of what I would do if he did return. Fear of what I would do if he didn't. At home, my husband became more attentive. He began noticing small things, asking if I wanted to go out for dinner, offering to make me tea before bed, even texting me during the day just to say hello. It was sweet, in a way that made me ache. Not because I didn't appreciate the gestures, but because I knew they were too late. The irony wasn't lost on me. For years I had wished for precisely this, for him to reach across the growing distance and remind me that he saw me. Now, when he finally did, all I felt was guilt. And still, I played along. I smiled, kissed his cheek, made polite conversation. I didn't lie outright, but I edited the truth with surgical precision. I answered the questions he never asked, and withheld the ones I feared he might. Then, on a Wednesday afternoon, I received a message. It wasn't from him, not directly. It was from someone I hadn't expected, a former patient of mine who had once attended a group session I co-facilitated. She mentioned seeing him recently at a local cafe and asked if I was still working with him individually. I stared at the message for a long time, heart pounding. The world around me seemed to tilt slightly, like the foundation had shifted beneath my feet. He was still in the city. He hadn't disappeared. He had simply stepped away. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in bed beside my husband, my eyes fixed on the ceiling fan as it turned in slow, steady circles. I listened to the rhythm of his breathing, wondered what he dreamed about. Whether he sensed the fracture between us. At dawn, I went to my office early. I brewed a pot of coffee, tidied the bookshelf, straightened the picture frames. I sat at my desk and opened a blank file on my computer, typing and deleting his name several times before closing it again. The uncertainty was unbearable. Late that evening, long after the last scheduled session, I remained at the clinic. I told myself I was catching up on paperwork, but the truth was simpler: I was waiting. I didn't expect him to come. So when the soft knock came against the frosted glass of my door, my entire body stilled. He stepped inside with hesitation in his eyes and something quieter than a smile on his lips. I didn't move. I didn't speak. He closed the door gently behind him and sat down across from me, as he always had. No clipboard, no pretense. Just the two of us in a room that no longer pretended to be neutral. We sat in silence for a long time. And then he said, "I thought about disappearing. I thought it would be easier for both of us." I nodded slowly, unsure if I was relieved or terrified. "But I couldn't," he continued. Not without knowing where this was going. There was a finality to his tone, not a threat, not even a request. Just a simple statement of truth. I leaned forward, elbows resting on my knees, and said the only thing I could say. Neither could I. The rest of the conversation was quiet. Measured. But layered. He told me about the time apart, how he had tried to create distance, not just physically, but emotionally. How it hadn't worked. I told him about the ache I had carried every day, pretending I didn't notice his absence, hiding how much I had hoped he would return. We didn't make declarations. We didn't plan next steps. But when he left that evening, the space between us had changed. It wasn't safe anymore. But it was honest. And somehow, that felt more sacred than anything I had felt in years. I left the clinic that evening with a strange stillness inside me. Not peace, not relief, but a quiet readiness, as though something that had long resisted definition had finally taken shape. The night air was cool against my skin. The city felt muffled, as if it too were holding its breath. I walked to my car slowly, deliberately, letting the sound of my heels against the pavement ground me. I didn't rush. There was no longer anything to resist. When I got home, the lights in the kitchen were already on. My husband was finishing up dinner, humming a familiar tune under his breath. I watched him for a moment from the hallway, his back turned, sleeves rolled up, his movements confident in their repetition. There had been a time when that rhythm comforted me. Now, it made me feel like a visitor in a place I used to belong. He looked over his shoulder and smiled when he saw me. "Perfect timing," he said. "Dinner's just about ready." I nodded, removing my coat and hanging it neatly in the closet. "Smells good," I replied, my voice even. We ate together, as we always did, exchanging stories from the day. I told him a patient had cancelled. He told me someone at work had brought in homemade muffins. The conversation moved smoothly, like water over polished stones. Polite. Uncomplicated. But beneath the surface, I felt it, my detachment. Not out of cruelty or indifference, but out of inevitability. After dinner, we watched television for a while. I sat beside him on the couch, hands folded in my lap, eyes on the screen but mind elsewhere. At some point, he reached for my hand and held it loosely in his. I let him. I didn't pull away. But I also didn't tighten my grip. When he went to bed, I stayed behind, pretending to be finishing emails. The screen in front of me remained blank. I stared at the cursor blinking steadily in the empty message box, waiting for it to tell me what to write. I wasn't tired. I didn't feel anything as straightforward as exhaustion or clarity. Only a steady rhythm of understanding. I could not continue living in two realities. One would eventually devour the other. By the time I turned off the lights and went upstairs, he was already asleep. His breathing was deep and slow, peaceful in a way I hadn't felt in years. I stood in the doorway for a moment, watching him, trying to imagine what he would feel if he knew. If he sensed how far away I had drifted. If he would even recognize the moment it had started. I slipped into the guest room again that night. My excuse was a lingering headache. He didn't question it. I think, on some level, he knew. The next morning, I woke early and made coffee before the sun rose. I sat at the kitchen table in silence, letting the quiet wrap around me like a second skin. I couldn't pretend anymore. The gap between who I was and who I had become had stretched too wide to ignore. I thought about the conversation from the night before, the way he had looked at me, not with accusation or demand, but with recognition. He hadn't asked me to explain anything. He hadn't needed to. Later that day, I packed a small bag. Not with any plan to leave permanently, not yet. Just a change of clothes, a book, a journal, and the key to my old studio apartment that I hadn't sold. I told myself I was taking space to think. But I knew better. I left a note on the counter. A brief one. No apologies, no promises. Just honesty. I need time. I don't know how long. Please don't try to talk me out of it. I left before he returned from work. The city looked different from the window of a cab than it did behind the wheel. More distant. Less mine. When I arrived at the apartment, I stood in the middle of the room, unsure of what to do. The space was small, almost bare, just a couch, a desk, and a mattress on the floor. But it was quiet. Uncomplicated. I set down my bag and sat on the floor, my back against the wall. The silence was different here. Not heavy, not hiding. Just present. That evening, I didn't call anyone. I didn't check my messages. I didn't reach for distraction. I let the stillness settle into my bones. I wrote in my journal until my hand cramped. Not about him. Not about the kiss. But about the moment I realized I had been lying to myself. I had thought I was doing the responsible thing. The moral thing. Protecting the people around me, protecting my work, protecting my marriage. But what I had really been doing was avoiding the truth. That I had stopped being honest with myself long before any of this started. That I had built my life on a foundation that no longer fit the person I had become. And that no one else could fix that for me. Not him. Not my husband. Only me. That night, I slept on the floor with a blanket pulled over my shoulders. The room was cold, but not uncomfortable. In the quiet dark, I didn't feel like I was running away. I felt like I was returning to something I had abandoned years ago. Myself. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel afraid of what came next. I felt ready. We spent the night together. The morning light through the narrow window was dull and gray, filtered through a haze of cloud cover that softened the room's hard edges. I woke slowly, with none of the usual sharpness that came with responsibilities or alarms. There was no schedule waiting for me, no clients to prepare for, no husband waiting downstairs with coffee already poured. There was only the sound of my own breath and the low hum of city life bleeding through the walls. For a moment, I stayed still, letting the unfamiliar quiet settle into my bones. The ache in my shoulders reminded me that I'd slept on a makeshift mattress with only a thin blanket, but it didn't bother me. In fact, it felt oddly earned. Honest. A kind of discomfort I didn't need to rationalize or apologize for. I moved slowly through the morning. Brushed my teeth with a travel-sized tube. Made coffee in the tiny machine I hadn't touched in years. Sat cross-legged on the floor to drink it. There were no mirrors in this apartment, at least not any large enough to see my whole face. That absence, too, felt like relief. By late morning, I opened my journal again, flipping through the pages from the last few weeks. My handwriting had changed. It was messier now, quicker, as if my thoughts no longer waited for permission before spilling onto the paper. I reread a few entries and felt a tug of sadness, but not regret. I had needed to write those things, even if no one else would ever see them. Eventually, I stood up and opened the window, letting the cold air bite at my skin. Below, people moved in steady streams, some on their phones, others in conversation, most just locked into their own timelines. I watched them for a while, detached but not indifferent. Life was happening, continuing, ignoring me completely. And somehow, that was comforting. In the afternoon, I left the apartment and walked with no clear destination. I moved through streets I hadn't visited in years, past cafes I used to frequent in my 20s, bookstores that still had the same sun-faded awnings. I stopped in front of one and went inside without thinking. The familiar scent of paper and dust greeted me like an old friend. I browsed slowly, trailing my fingers along the spines of novels and collections of essays. In the psychology section, I paused when I saw a title I had once assigned in a university course, The Myth of the Well-Adjusted Adult. I smiled quietly to myself and picked it up. At the counter, the clerk asked if I wanted a bag. I declined. Outside, I found a small bench near the park and sat down, opening the book to the first page. I didn't read much. Just enough to remember why I had once loved the process of learning, of reflecting, of challenging what I thought I knew. I returned to the apartment as the light began to fade. The day had passed without urgency. For the first time in a long time, I had lived a full day without performing a role. Not therapist. Not wife. Just a person, alone in the world, choosing each next step deliberately. That night, I cooked for myself, nothing elaborate, just roasted vegetables and rice. I ate slowly, without distractions, tasting every bite as if I needed the grounding. There was something sacred about the simplicity of it. Not lonely. Just quiet. Later, I sat at the small desk by the window and began drafting a letter I knew I wouldn't send. It wasn't to him. It wasn't to my husband. It was to the woman I had been before everything began. I don't blame you, I wrote. You did your best. You followed the rules. You loved honestly, even when it didn't feel returned. You gave yourself away in tiny pieces, believing that was the price of stability. But you forgot to keep something for yourself. I paused, then underlined the last sentence. You forgot to keep something for yourself. The words sat heavy on the page, like confession and forgiveness at once. Just after 10, I received a message from my husband. A simple one. Are you safe? It read. I stared at it for a long moment, my thumb hovering over the screen. Then I typed, yes. I just need time. I didn't explain further. He didn't ask anything else. When I closed the phone, I sat on the edge of the bed, not ready to lie down just yet. My thoughts drifted to the clinic, to the chair where he had once sat, to the last moment we had shared before everything crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. I didn't miss the chaos of it. I missed the clarity. The undeniable truth that, for a moment, I had felt more alive than I had in years. But clarity didn't always mean permanence. It didn't guarantee direction. Sometimes it only lit up what had been hidden. What needed to change. And that was enough, for now. As I turned off the light and lay down under the blanket, I listened to the sounds of the apartment settling, the pipes groaning faintly, the wind scratching against the windowpane. It wasn't home, not yet. But it was a beginning. In the dark, I whispered a quiet truth to no one in particular. I don't know where this leads. And that, for the first time, didn't scare me. The following days passed without pattern. I stopped trying to organize my time, to fill the hours with checklists or excuses. I no longer needed to justify my stillness. In that apartment, stripped of expectations, I gave myself permission to be aimless. There was no one to perform for, no schedule to uphold, no identity I was required to fit into. That solitude, while sometimes unsettling, became a kind of therapy in itself. I read more. Not research articles, not clinical essays as fiction, essays, poetry. Words that didn't need to explain anything but instead simply existed to be felt. I found comfort in sentences that wandered, in stories that didn't resolve. My thoughts mirrored those arcs, uncertain, unhurried, unfinished. Sometimes I would walk for hours, taking side streets I had never noticed before, sitting on park benches, watching strangers pass. I observed their gestures, the way they held coffee cups, the way they leaned into conversation or walked with headphones in. It reminded me that everyone carried something invisible. Not all stories could be guessed by glancing. I didn't return to the clinic. I had left my calendar on pause, blocked off the schedule without explanation. A few clients had reached out. I'd responded gently, letting them know I needed time away. Some had expressed concern. Others simply accepted it. I didn't feel guilty. For once, I was choosing my own boundaries. I also didn't speak to my husband again. He hadn't messaged after the one text. I imagined him coming home each evening to the silence I had left behind. I imagined the note still sitting on the counter. I wondered if he reread it. If he had expected this to be a short-lived impulse. If he still did. But I couldn't let myself return just because he was waiting. I had done that too many times in too many ways over the years, returned to what was safe, what was expected, even when it no longer fit. This was not about punishing him. It was about finally listening to myself, the version of me that had been whispering through cracks for far too long. And yet, despite all the reflection and quiet, there was still one name that lived on the edge of every thought. He hadn't reached out. I didn't know if that meant respect, distance, confusion, or finality. Maybe all of it. But it lingered, an unanswered question that hummed just under my skin. It was late afternoon when I finally opened my laptop and typed his name into a blank email. I didn't write anything else. Just his name. Then I closed the tab and shut the computer. I wasn't ready. And maybe he wasn't either. But the silence between us was no longer heavy. It wasn't a wound. It was something softer. A waiting space. An unfinished conversation. One evening, I returned to my old neighborhood and walked past our house. I stayed on the opposite sidewalk, partially hidden by trees. The lights inside were on. Curtains drawn. Familiar. I could almost see myself in that window, sitting with a book or folding laundry. It struck me how easily a life could continue in your absence. How rooms held their shape even when the person inside them changed. I didn't go closer. Instead, I sat on a bench down the street and let the familiarity wash over me like warm rain. That house had been my whole world for years. And yet, from this distance, it looked like a painting I once knew how to describe but could no longer name. Eventually, I stood and walked away. My steps didn't falter. The pull I had once felt toward that place no longer anchored me. That in itself was a quiet victory. Back at the apartment, I showered and made tea, then curled up on the couch with a worn blanket and let the stillness hold me. I didn't feel lonely. I felt full. A different kind of full than I had ever known, one not built on external affirmation or predictable roles, but on something internal. A center I was just beginning to recognize as mine. I found myself writing again that night. Not in my journal, but in a document on my laptop. I didn't know what it was becoming, an essay, a letter, a story. I just wrote about what it meant to outgrow yourself. About the cost of honesty. About the way guilt sometimes disguises itself as loyalty. And how liberation often arrives quietly, disguised as small choices that accumulate until you can't go back. The writing poured out of me faster than I expected. I didn't edit. I didn't reread. I just kept going until the sky outside shifted from black to deep blue. I closed the laptop without saving the file. I didn't need to hold on to it. The act of writing had been enough. In the morning, I woke with a sense of clarity, not about the future, not about outcomes, but about myself. I had spent so much of my life being careful. Choosing the measured word. The diplomatic response. The predictable decision. And in doing so, I had kept parts of myself in shadow. Now, even if the next steps weren't clear, I was no longer afraid of the light. A week later, I returned to the clinic, not to reopen my schedule, not yet. Just to sit in my office. To feel what had changed. The room looked the same. Neatly organized. Calm. But I was not the same woman who had last sat in that chair. I didn't stay long. On my way out, I left a note on the desk. Just a line I had scribbled without thinking: healing isn't always quiet. Sometimes it sounds like leaving. I locked the door behind me and stepped back into the afternoon sun. I didn't look back. The morning I signed the rental agreement for a new apartment, I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't even feel relief. What I felt was something more subdued, a kind of groundedness, like the moment a plane touches down after hours of flight. You're not quite at your destination, but your feet are finally close to solid ground again. The space was small, practical, with a narrow balcony and pale wooden floors. I didn't choose it for charm. I chose it because it felt neutral, like a clean page. It had no memories, no shadows in the corners, no remnants of past versions of myself. I could build something here that wasn't reactive. That wasn't built in opposition to anything. I moved slowly, bringing only a few boxes from storage, books, kitchen basics, a framed photograph from my childhood. I didn't bring much from the house I had shared with my husband. Not because I wanted to erase it, but because I didn't want to recreate it. There were no big declarations between us. No shouting matches, no ultimatums. When I told him I wouldn't be coming back, he responded with quiet acceptance. His message was short. I understand. I'll take care of everything on my side. That was it. And I believed him. I think we both knew, long before I left, that the ending had begun years earlier. The apartment came with a small desk, just big enough for my laptop and a stack of notebooks. I began writing again, not professionally, not with any outcome in mind, but to explore what had happened to me. What I had allowed. What I had abandoned. What I had reclaimed. The writing didn't always make sense. Some days it was reflective and precise. Other days it spilled across the page in fragments. But it was mine. And it was honest. The clinic called once. The office manager checking in. I told her I would not be returning as the same therapist, and I wasn't sure when, if ever, I'd resume practice in the same form. She was kind. She understood more than I expected. Eventually, I started teaching part-time at a community center. A course on emotional literacy for adults. Nothing clinical. Just open discussion about fear, identity, change. The kind of work that allowed for vulnerability without diagnosis. It felt like the right pace. Something I could offer without losing myself again. One afternoon, as I packed up my materials after a session, someone tapped me on the shoulder. I turned, expecting a student with a question, but it was him. He looked almost exactly as I remembered. The same quiet gravity in his posture, the same steady gaze. But there was something lighter in his expression. Something unburdened. We stood there for a long moment without speaking. And then, simply, I smiled. He smiled too. He said he had heard about the course from a friend. That he'd been meaning to attend, but hadn't gotten around to it. I nodded, not asking whether the friend existed or if he had simply come to see me. It didn't matter. We stepped outside together and walked toward the corner. The sun was beginning to set, the sky streaked in soft golds and blues. We didn't talk much. Just walked in step, sharing the kind of silence that had always come easily to us. At the intersection, we paused. He turned toward me and said, "I'm glad you found your way." I nodded, unsure how to respond. Then said, "I'm still finding it. But I'm walking it on my own terms now." There was nothing more to say. We parted there, no promises, no backward glances. Just a simple acknowledgement that what had existed between us had mattered. And that it didn't need to be anything else now. Back in my apartment, I sat on the balcony with a cup of tea, letting the evening settle around me. The city hummed quietly below, distant but familiar. I opened my journal and wrote the final entry I would keep in that particular notebook. I have not healed fully. But I have stopped hiding from the wound. I am not finished. But I am honest. And in that honesty, I have found something stronger than safety, freedom. As I closed the notebook, I thought of everything I had lost. The house. The career I had clung to too tightly. The identity I had once mistaken for stability. And I realized, they were never mine to keep forever. They were stepping stones. Costumes. Training grounds. What remained now was not perfect, but it was mine. I lived alone. I cooked for one. I worked in a way that didn't consume me. I walked often. I read often. I allowed myself to be bored. To be still. To be unknown. There were no epilogues. No new romances. No grand resolutions. Just the quiet certainty that I had returned to myself. And I had no intention of leaving again.